We take that stack of sources, we distill the knowledge, and really, we give you the shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we are wading into, well, a policy shift that is nothing short of revolutionary and deeply controversial. We're diving deep into that seismic announcement from October 2nd, 2025. That's when President Trump formally told Congress the United States is now, quote, engaged in an armed conflict with drug cartels.
Yeah, and that specific phrase, armed conflict, moving this, war on drugs from law enforcement into that domain, that's the core challenge here for you, the listener. It immediately expands presidential war powers. I mean, in ways we've almost exclusively reserved for, like traditional military conflicts overseas. It's a huge legal, political, and frankly, operational pivot.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack all this source material. We want to detail the specific military actions that came before this declaration, look at the very specific legal justifications the White House is using, and then track the fallout, both international and here at home. But we really need to start with the language itself, because that's where the historical weight really lies. When the administration made this declaration, they didn't just label cartel members criminals or, smugglers. They specifically classified them as unlawful combatants. Now, if you follow national security stuff, that phrase just jumps out. It's loaded. It's terminology we usually hear for, like captured al-Qaeda operatives.
Exactly. That's precisely what makes this so, well, extraordinary. And what's fascinating, really, is what the White House is trying to do with that designation, practically speaking. If they frame these anti-cartel campaigns as an armed conflict, and the members are unlawful combatants, then the administration is attempting to activate powers. Powers established, really, in that post-9/11 legal framework.
Okay, let's pause on that implication for a second, because it's absolutely critical. When we hear unlawful combatant, what does that actually give the executive branch that, say, standard criminal prosecution doesn't?
Well, potentially, it grants them two extremely severe powers. And legal experts are already scrutinizing these intensely, as you'd expect. First, the sources point to the stated ability to detain cartel members indefinitely, without charge, under the laws of war.
Indefinitely.
And second, the ability to prosecute them not in regular federal courts, but in military tribunals. We've seen how this plays out. Places like Guantanamo Bay over the last couple of decades, applying that legal architecture to drug trafficking organizations. I mean, it fundamentally redefines who the U.S. can wage war on and how they can do it.
And you can immediately see why legal experts, human rights groups, are already arguing that these strikes, this whole designation, it fundamentally violates established international law. They're saying these groups, sure, they're horrific criminal enterprises, but they just don't meet the threshold needed to trigger the laws of armed conflict. This isn't just political disagreement, it's a foundational legal challenge.
It's a massive legal shift, absolutely. And, to understand the timing, why this declaration on October 2nd, we have to look back at what happened in September.
Yeah.
Because the administration needed specific military actions, specific events to cite when they went to Congress.
That's right. The notice to Congress, it directly follows a specific series of U.S. military ops in the Caribbean just last month. So this wasn't some sudden policy idea. It was a military campaign first, then the legal justification.
And we have some pretty concrete details on how severe those operations were. American forces, in several different incidents, sank at least 3 boats, allegedly carrying narcotics. The reports we have detail that these strikes resulted in the tragic deaths of 17 people. And it's important context here that at least 2 of these vessels reportedly set off from near Venezuela's coast.
The sources also highlight one specific incident the president mentioned in his declaration. This was the first one, apparently, back on September 2nd. U.S. forces struck a vessel. It had 11 people on board, and all were killed. Now, here's the linchpin, right? This connects the actual operation to the legal argument they're making.
Yes, exactly. The administration was very, very precise in identifying the group operating that specific boat on September 2nd. They claimed it was operated by members of Tren de Aragua. Now, why mention them specifically? Because this Venezuelan criminal network, Tren de Aragua, had already been designated as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, earlier in the year.
Ah, okay, so that FTO designation, that's the crucial piece of, well, bureaucratic maneuvering, isn't it? It lets the administration kind of sidestep needing a new, specific authorization for military force from Congress. By defining them as a terrorist group first, they can argue existing authorizations already apply.
Precisely. If you connect this back to the bigger legal picture, the administration's argument for bypassing the need for a specific congressional authorization for use of military force, an AUMF. It's rooted entirely in that terrorist designation. They're essentially saying, look, we're fighting a designated terrorist enemy here, and existing frameworks, existing laws permit this kind of armed conflict.
Okay, so let's pivot then to the administration's main justification for taking such an extraordinary step in the first place. They argue that these record levels of drugs flowing into the U.S., it poses such an overwhelming national security threat that, well, only a military response will do.
And we really can't ignore the severity of the crisis that provides that context. The reports really highlight this nearly 100,000 Americans dying each year from drug overdoses, the vast majority, tragically, linked to fentanyl. When you look at numbers like that, the scale of the human cost is just undeniable. It certainly elevates it beyond, typical crime in a lot of people's minds.
But this raises a really important question, doesn't it? And this is where maybe the aha moment, that critical nuance for you, the listener, comes in. If the goal, the stated goal, is truly to stop the fentanyl crisis, the sources note a kind of geographical disconnect. While these initial military strikes focus heavily on vessels in the Caribbean, linked to Venezuela, experts consistently point out that the vast majority of fentanyl actually entering the United States comes from Mexico, across the land border. So why the heavy operational focus on these maritime routes linked to Venezuela first? How does the administration explain that geopolitical calculation?
And this is where that political friction point gets really sharp. Critics argue, look, focusing on a state adversary like Venezuela, which already has poor relations with the U.S., it provides an easier political target than tackling Mexico, right? Mexico is a vital border partner. However, the administration's legal argument tries to neutralize this criticism. They focus on the legal status of the groups involved, like Tren de Aragua, with its FTO designation, rather than the primary source of the drug itself.
So the argument is less about where the most fentanyl comes from and more about who they can legally target under this new framework.
Essentially, yes. Their argument is that the FTO designation allows them to target groups like Tren de Aragua specifically, wherever they operate, particularly in these transit routes. The idea is to disrupt the supply chain before it reaches the land border. But the political implication, it definitely remains. They initiated an armed conflict based on strikes conducted in an area that is arguably secondary to the primary source of the lethal narcotic causing the crisis.
Right. And that strategic targeting based on that specific FTO designation, that then becomes the battleground for the whole war powers debate, doesn't it? Okay, moving on to the domestic fallout. It was immediate, intense. Democratic lawmakers straight away criticized the strikes, questioning the legality, warning that the war powers resolution explicitly requires Congress to authorize military action. This looks like it's going to be a massive constitutional standoff over the separation of powers.
Oh, absolutely. Congress sees this, or at least many in Congress see this, as the executive branch trying to unilaterally stir military action against a whole new type of enemy without getting legislative approval first.
Yeah.
It echoes those historical concerns we've seen about presidential overreach, particularly following the post-9/11 AUMF era.
And the international reaction.
Just as pointed. Especially, as you'd expect from Venezuela, given where those September strikes happened. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez publicly condemned the actions, called them a U.S. provocation. And he backed that up by claiming 5 American fighter jets were spotted near Venezuelan airspace just this week. He called it a major threat against the nation's security.
Wow, okay, that definitely escalates the tension significantly. And what seems to frustrate lawmakers the most, reading through the sources, is this lingering ambiguity, this lack of clarity about the scope of this new conflict. Pentagon officials apparently haven't disclosed which specific groups, beyond that initial mention of Tren de Aragua, are actually included in this new armed conflict designation.
And, that lack of clarity, it's probably intentional, but it's deeply problematic for any kind of oversight. By not drawing clear lines, the administration keeps maximum operational flexibility for itself. But Congress is left kind of hamstrung, unable to properly scrutinize the boundaries of these new expanded war powers. Are they targeting every cartel now? Just the ones with an FTO designation? That boundary defines the potential scale of this conflict, and right now, it's blurry.
So what does this all mean going forward? Well, this declaration, this armed conflict against drug cartels, it's expected to trigger a really intensifying debate over 3 key areas, it looks like. First, the limits of presidential war powers, especially in these non-traditional conflicts. Second, the fundamental role of Congress in authorizing military action against non-state actors like cartels. And third, the long-term geopolitical fallout, the human rights consequences of officially militarizing the fight against criminal trafficking networks.
Yeah, this whole situation is really pushing at the fundamental legal boundaries of how the U.S. wages war, and importantly, on whom it wages war. By successfully leveraging that existing terrorist organization designation, the administration is attempting to justify using powers like indefinite detention, military tribunals, against groups that for decades have been handled purely as criminal networks. That blending, that blurring of the lines between the criminal threat model and the terrorist threat model. That's really the defining legal feature of this conflict as it moves forward, something you really need to watch.
So, as you consider the sheer magnitude of this policy shift, here's a final provocative thought for you to maybe mull over on your own. The administration argues the severity of drug deaths, nearly 100,000 a year, elevates drug trafficking to a national security threat that demands a military response. Fair enough, that's their argument. But how does that geographic disconnect? We talked about the primary source of fentanyl being Mexico, yet the initial high-fatality military strikes focusing heavily on the Caribbean, on vessels linked to Venezuela. How does that impact the legitimacy, maybe the effectiveness of this new military approach? And what might that targeting choice suggest about the administration's perhaps true geopolitical priorities here? Something to explore.